All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I hope you all had a chance to get some food. If you want any more food, please feel free to go check out the Sugar and Spice in the lobby over there. One thing that we were just talking about before we get started. So if you look behind you, there's a camera, and so we're recording the panel tonight. And we're going to put it up on YouTube, which is something that we did last year. That was really great. But if you're in the audience over here, your face won't be in the shot at all. It's all going to be focused on us. The only time you might be recorded is if you ask a question later on. And so we'll pass the mic over. And if you have any concerns about that, just definitely come talk to me after the program. We'll talk about it. It's no problem at all. But I just want to make you aware of that. So, but anyway, welcome again. So this is the third of a series of panels that we've done that we're calling the New Directions series in chaplaincy, kind of. And so my name's Walker. If I don't know you already, my name's Walker. I'm the humanist in residence here at Tufts and one of the university chaplains. And I work especially with the kind of growing community. Yeah, come on. The growing community of students here who identify kind of outside of the organized religion or the checkboxes about organized religion on a lot of surveys. And I identify as non-religious or atheist or humanist. And I work a lot with the humanist community at Tufts. That's the TCU student group. Some of the members are here tonight, and they organized the Death Cafe last week in conjunction with this program, which I hear was really great. So I've also been, it's also want to mention that I've been a student chaplain at Brigham and Women's Hospital downtown, which is how I met Cheryl. And Cheryl will say a little more about her role in a second. And the last couple of years, this program that we've done, which has been hosted by the Humanist Chaplaincy and HCAT, has been a way for us to kind of raise up, for one, a way to like raise up this idea of chaplaincy as like a vocation and talk about what this idea of chaplaincy looks like today, and especially to draw attention to like the dimension of chaplaincy work that deals with people who don't fit into traditional, religious boxes, especially atheists and humanists, who are not only nowadays kind of seeking out resources that chaplaincies offer more and more nowadays, but are also pursuing chaplaincy work and becoming humanist chaplains themselves, like Jason and myself. And so with this series, a couple years ago, we asked the question, well, so if people are becoming humanist chaplains more, what does that work look like? And like, how are people sort of taking what they call humanist values and putting them into action? And we talked to a leader of an ethical culture society. We talked to the former assistant humanist chaplain at Harvard, and we talked to someone who was pursuing humanist chaplaincy in the military. And then last year, we broadened it a little bit. We invited people who are doing chaplaincy in a lot of different areas and asked sort of, well, if there is this growing population of NONES nuns, religious nuns or non-religious people, how is your chaplaincy work in these different areas looking differently because of that? And so and last year we were talking to somebody who does chaplaincy in a prison, someone who works in higher ed, someone who works in hospice care, and someone who works more generally in healthcare. And so this time around, we're honing in even a bit more on that question. We're going to talk about a particular dimension of healthcare, especially that we talk about, we call end-of-life care. And so end-of-life care kind of includes an array of decisions and resources and treatment options and support systems that are offered to people in the healthcare system when they're approaching death, or it seems very likely that they're approaching death. And end-of-life care as its own field has changed quite dramatically in the last 50 or 60 years itself, especially with the growth of what's called the hospice movement, which Andrew can talk more about from his work, but hospice in general, and around the world, hospices can be institutions. In America especially, hospice is a kind of a philosophy of healthcare that approaches end-of-life care by, rather than prioritizing like pursuing different treatment options and curing the disease, it's sort of offering care to the whole person, offering care to the person as someone who's a full social and spiritual being. And naturally, chaplains are an important part of a lot of hospice work. So while end-of-life care is changing in philosophy and practice, and these demographics of religion are changing, there's growing numbers of people who are identifying outside of religion, what I want to look at tonight, and hopefully we can work together to look at, is this idea, like where are the intersections of these two changes? Where is, if there are new needs being presented by American patients in end-of-life care, how are we changing our approaches in end-of-life care to meet those? And And if there maybe aren't new needs, maybe these demographic changes aren't really changing how we do care, what does that say about how we talk about death and how we talk about end-of-life care? And that's kind of the background of what I want to talk about tonight. So with that, I think I'm gonna ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves. I think you'll do more justice than I can. So maybe starting with Andrew here. Andrew, why don't you share, well, your name and a little bit about your background, like your current role, maybe a little bit like what led you to that role, and then also, because I don't know that everyone here maybe knows what we mean when we say chaplain or chaplaincy or spiritual care provider. Do you mind giving just like a short definition of like how you think of that role? What does it mean to be a chaplain or a spiritual care provider to you?
My name is Andrew Tripp, and I work with Chelsea Jewish Life Care, which is an elder service continuum of care umbrella agency. And my work with the hospice team is as the spiritual care coordinator. Hospice is moving away from the language of chaplain because chaplain is overly Christian in its connotation. It's not that other traditions can't have professional chaplains so much as that's the language that Christians had been using, and then now other traditions by default have to adopt to that, which is, its own way colonizing. So that's why hospice has moved to spiritual care coordinator, that or spiritual counselor, depending upon hospice to hospice. But it's looking at Medicare guidelines where the spiritual needs of clients and family need to be palliated as part of the end of life process. Not the religious needs. It's explicitly not the religious needs, it's the spiritual needs. Recognizing that spiritual needs are personal and relational, and you might have a religious tradition, and that religious tradition might actually not speak to your spiritual needs, especially at end of life whatsoever. So someone who is professionally trained to handle fears, anxieties, but also conflicts between you and your family, you and your care team. And it's also to provide a grounded center to the rest of the hospice team. Hospice is the one place in healthcare where there is genuinely an interdisciplinary focus. So it is a team instead of siloization. It's not just the nurse taking care of the medical needs and the social worker doing paperwork. It's a team-based approach to make sure that folks at end of life in all of their needs are having their appropriate goals met and their appropriate pains palliated. And I think that in a long way answered your question.
No, thank you. Yeah. Cheryl?
Sure. Hi, I'm Cheryl McDevitt. I'm acute care chaplain and CPE supervisor at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. I've been a chaplain since I did CPE at St. Elizabeth's in Boston in 2004. And I love it. It's the most meaningful work, I think, on the planet. But I have certainly seen our profession evolve, and I have certainly evolved myself within it. Give just a little bit of background to give you a little bit better understanding of how this transformation has happened for me and how I see the work, the service that we do. I grew up in a fairly religious family, Catholic family, and for me, religion was a way to make meaning out of a great deal of personal, unspeakable suffering of my own around being gay. And that wasn't an option in the 1970s for me or for my family. And I don't regret it, because it did give my life meaning. Obviously, not meaning enough, because here I am. But it was when two of my family members, my mother and my sister, were both actively dying, one of Parkinson's disease and one of cancer, at the very same time, and I was primary caregiver to both of them, and watched the deeper healing that happened in our family over the course of the year that they were both so sick and in hospice. That was so much deeper than the physical healing, and as I bore witness to that spiritual healing and what did and didn't happen and what we needed and what we didn't get and what we did get in hospice, I decided to become a chaplain. And it was really in the clinical pastoral education program, which I don't know how familiar folks are with that, but it's a very transformative program because it puts you in a diverse world where meaning perspectives are shared and we expand our understanding of each other, and my world really changed then. And so I've been a chaplain, and my first assignment, sorry, I'm kind of losing my train of thoughts here, sorry about that. My first assignment, I wanted to care for people at end of life, but I was assigned to the addiction unit at St. Elizabeth's, which was not what I had in mind. But I loved it. I still love it. It was my favorite place to be because it was people who were struggling with meaning perspective around what is a higher power, what is their spirituality, and to just bear witness to that struggle. And to realize that religion happens in the black and white, but life happens in the shades of gray. And to walk with people through that and to just accompany them and bear witness to that. And so that's really the sort of, even though those people weren't dying, the behavioral health experience that I have and the great love that I have for people who are trying to make meaning out of a great deal of suffering is what has sort of given me why I'm here.
Good evening. My name is Jason Callahan. I am the chaplain for the Thomas Palliative Care Unit at VCU Massey Cancer Center, and also an instructor for the Department of Patient Counseling at Virginia Commonwealth University. So I get to train chaplains a little bit, but most of my work is done in the clinical setting when I'm the palliative care chaplain. I'm also endorsed by the Humanist Society. In chaplaincy, you all have to get endorsements, ecclesiastical endorsements, and the Humanist Society has endorsed me so I can actually have a job. But I came from the business world, actually. I'll give you a little background of me. I grew up exploring a couple of different religions until the time I was about 10 years old, where my family was primarily Presbyterian. We went to the church where my grandmother attended for many years, and my mother brought my brother and I there. But I grew up really struggling because although I had a strong spiritual side to me, religion wasn't necessarily where I found comfort. I found that actually a lot of things in my life, religious language just couldn't articulate what I was feeling, or it wasn't very supportive. However, I found that I did have community. So in college, I kind of got away from all of that stuff. And then when I started working in the business world, I was missing some of that. So I started exploring once again, which is when I really developed an idea that I was a humanist. And I decided that I wanted to stop selling poison to kids. That's what I called it when I was in the business world. So I spoke with my pastor that I grew up with, and she told me that I had a calling. And this is Christian language for there's something going on in your life that you're kind of being directed towards. It was really just my desire to do something where I was helping people, but that was the language that was used. So I ended up going down to Richmond, Virginia, where I attended seminary on a trial year basis for people that didn't necessarily know whether or not they were going to go into doing some church work, religion, whether you were going to be nonprofit. But I went there, and after the first year, decided that I was just going to stick it out because I had changed my whole life up. I couldn't really go back to New York doing what I was doing. And after that experience, I decided that I did not want to work in the church. And unfortunately, I was kind of stuck in a place where I didn't know what to do. But fortunately, VCU has a CPE center, kind of like what Cheryl was talking about. VCU had a CPE center where they train chaplains, and that's where I really found myself coming alive, because it tore down a lot of the theological training that I had that really I needed to discard because it wasn't helping me help people. And it gave me some of the tools that I needed to actually be present for people. And doing it as a humanist, I do it in a way where I don't necessarily have constraints, theological beliefs that damage my ability to be at the bedside and receive someone else's faith belief system. So that's kind of how I got into doing chaplaincy, specifically the end-of-life care and working in palliative care, because the reality is everybody's going to die sometime. This is usually the largest existential issue we're dealing with at some point in our lives. And being there at the bedside with people at these moments is the greatest benefit, it's the greatest honor I've ever had in my life. So to sum it up, that's a little bit how I got in there and why I do chaplaincy.
Thank you all very much. So I have a few questions here. We definitely have a great group to really lead for conversation, so we'll leave a lot of space in just a few minutes for people to ask their own questions and share their own thoughts. But the one question that I wanted us to hit, people, in my experience, I think for you too, people have a lot of different needs, like both at end of life and in cases of acute suffering. People have a lot of different needs outside of medical care. And at least at the Brigham, we talk about unfinished business, people's family concerns, their kind of more existential questions. Some religious patients often have sacramental needs. But at the same time, different chaplains, I think about chaplaincy that I think is quite interesting. Different chaplains who come from different backgrounds, who have different styles of connecting with patients and are accessible in different ways. Even when we're centering the needs of the patient, we can be offering very different things to the same patient, and it can still be thought of as effective spiritual care. So maybe starting with Cheryl this time, what maybe have you found in your role as a chaplain at the Brigham to be important in your relationships, either with patients who are dying or with patients in acute suffering? What kind of things often come up?
I think my favorite image for a spiritual care professional or chaplain, which I don't really like that word. I usually don't use the word chaplain. But my favorite image is the kind stranger. And I think my greatest hope, I think, is to be a safe space to companion a person in the meaning making that goes on around end of life. So I bring my most human self, and my hope is to be as approachable as I can. And I usually enter the room and say, "Hey, I'm Cheryl. I'm part of the team here. I'm from spiritual care. A lot of people are coming and checking on your body, and I'm just checking on your spirits." And that kind of takes the sort of, urge to throw the Kleenex box at me. If I was in their shoes, the last thing in the world I would want would be someone to come in with a religious agenda. And I think that a lot of times people are fearful of that, and I think that's always for very good reason. If you were to suss out their reason for that, it would probably be a very good one. But people don't really want answers. They want someone to listen to their questions, and I think some of the questions and things that people struggle with aren't really for the sake of guidance, but for the sake of they're more feelings to be expressed than questions to be answered. So I come in, I think, more than anything, to companion and accompany, and to bring my most human self. I ask a lot of questions that start with "help me understand," and it might be "help me understand what you hope for," "help me understand what you're most afraid of," "help me understand what's most important to you," "help me understand where your strength is coming from right now," and sometimes just the very kind of human things like, "How did you sleep last night?" That's a question that we all can relate to the importance of that. Or, "How's that grilled cheese you're working on? Is that book any good that you're reading?" To just kind of pull up alongside and let them run the show. But I think I often will say at the end of our conversation, "How can I support you, or how can spiritual care services support you while you're here?" And by far the most common response to that is, "Just come by, just stop by now and then." And I think that's what people want most.
Should I go next? So I agree with that completely. When I was in CPE, Henry Nouwen has this book, The Wounded Healer. right? And that's one that chaplains, spiritual caregivers go to a lot, because the reality is if you're not in touch with your own humanity, you're not really going to be able to do anything at the bedside. And people can pick up on that pretty easily, you know. They don't want that authoritative figure. They have doctors in the hospital that have been, you know, kind of messing with them, pressing their buttons, you know, poking them, prodding them, and they just kind of need somebody at their bedside. So what I try to do is just kind of be that supportive, non-anxious presence, someone that can receive, but also help them reflect, ask the kind of questions in order to help them dig deeper with whatever they're experiencing as well. You know, in the hospital, it's really important because since you're surrounded by these machines, a lot of them are going off and beeping all the time. It kind of reminds you, or it tells you that you're not human. You know, you're experiencing something, but your life has ceased to exist. And there's only one thing that's important. And in the life care with chaplaincy and spiritual care, we try to bring the whole person. So I'll focus more on what they would be doing if they were outside and how it impacts them that they're not able to do that. You know, you want to imagine what someone who is no longer able to use their hands, what is that like for them if their entire life they've been working and their identities are tied up in there. So I try to give them back some of themselves, but that starts with listening and just paying attention and being aware of who they are as a person, allowing them to tell their story, but also being a part of that. We call it an interdisciplinary team, knowing that you're not alone, knowing that you have one piece of the puzzle, then everybody's kind of working together to help support this person moving forward.
I'd like to piggyback on the listening. This January, for the first time in my life, I was hospitalized, and before that, I thought of myself as this very healthy person, big, strong guy, never worried about my health. But I'd had a lot of experience in healthcare caring for others, so I knew that healthcare did this really good job of dehumanizing you and robbing you of any dignity you might have. And healthcare does a good job of reducing who you are. You're reduced to a diagnosis, you're reduced to a treatment, you're reduced to these tasks that these overworked healthcare providers have to do. You're not a person. In medical spiritual care is one of the few places in the medical field where your job is to reassert that dignity and reassert that humanity of the patients. That the pain that you're palliating as a spiritual care provider could be the pain that's being caused by being in a medical institution. When I was on a bed, helpless, in profound pain, and having people wake me up at ludicrous hours of the evening so that way I could be poked with new sharps, and I had no autonomy and I had no agency. It was really awful. And coming from healthcare, spiritual care, I'd asked for chaplain visits, and during my stay, no chaplain came to see me, and it was really, really, it was the only negative thing I wrote on the survey that I gave back to the hospital about their customer service, because I didn't have someone who could help give me back my dignity. And in end-of-life care, everything is taking away your dignity. Your agency is being stripped away from you. A lot of the clients that I have either have dementia as their primary diagnosis or as a comorbidity. And so your very body is stripping you of agency, and it becomes the job of the spiritual caregiver not just to listen to what you say, but to listen to the personhood that's inside the shell. I had a CPE supervisor who said you're listening with your third ear, because you're trying to look at what's the message behind what is being said and what is looking to be conveyed. And that's when you're just witnessing the authentic humanity of the person you're with. And that's the power of chaplaincy.
Yeah. Thank you all for sharing that. I mean, I think, and when we think of giving people their dignity back and stuff, I mean, the language that we use can be so important to affirming that dignity. And I think that a lot of and so, Andrew and Cheryl, you both talked about the use of this word chaplain and kind of at least connotations or origins of the word chaplain in Christianity. And I think that, at least in my experience, for entering the room of a patient who I might, expect or I might find out is not religious, like often like the response to say like, oh, hi, I'm a chaplain. If I go in and say like, hi, I'm a chaplain, it's the throw the tissues at you, or just like metaphorically, like, you're not for me, thanks, but like that's really not I'm not the person you're here to see. You must be kind of mistaken sometimes. And so I wonder, like, as we think about more and more people saying like not affiliated, no preference in their religious, identity, or even actively kind of more like I'm an atheist, I'm a secular humanist, maybe starting with Jason, do you want to talk about some of the ways that you've found to either present yourself or connect with patients at end of life or elsewhere in their care, who are outside, traditional religion, especially when, they might be suspicious of this term chaplaincy conceptually,
Yeah, absolutely. So, at VCU Health, we have these large yellow badges that say doctor on them. They say nurse practitioner, and they even say chaplain. So no matter where you go, you have this thing that announces who you are. So, and that's kind of the reason why I use chaplain, because it's consistent with my job title, even though I can use it interchangeably depending on who I'm talking to. And it does serve as a large barrier a lot of times if you're not religious, because the reality is the history of that word, it immediately makes someone think, okay, here we go. Here's someone who's going to preach to me. I don't need this stuff right now. But the fortunate thing about being a chaplain is you are not confined to whatever they believe a chaplain is. So I actually use this as an opportunity to say, okay, well, what do you think a chaplain is? Let's uncover some of the history of that word for you, because it might mean something different to you. And then we work with that. That's just kind of one of the challenges that we do have. And a lot of times I just try to identify where the person is. So I've gone in rooms before and just played video games with somebody because that's the language they spoke. And then once they saw that I was here just to be with them, it opened up the possibilities for many things. It opens up the possibilities that I don't even need to do any kind of questions, no talks. A good chaplain can go in the room and not say one word and do a really good job. And when this person is already kind of processing things and just the presence of someone else is by there, that builds a relationship, which also in turn, kind of builds relationship with the IDT staff as well, because when they see that they're connected to you and you've established that relationship, it actually opens the door for that physical healing to come a lot more effectively than it would have if they weren't receiving that kind of support.
Andrew, do you have any thoughts? Like presenting that idea of like chaplaincy as an accessible way, or a spiritual care coordinator or provider in an accessible way?
One of the benefits in hospice is I have a team, and once you've proven your salt to the nurses, they're going to be the ones that get you into the house, or they're going to be the ones to get you into the room, because they'll be like, they do the initial assessment, and part of that initial assessment is asking, would you like to see a chaplain? Do you have any spiritual needs? When they're the ones saying, oh, but Andrew's not like that, and they've already built this really great alliance with the patient, then the patient will trust them and be like, oh, okay, then he can come. It's letting other people show off your bona fides before you do, so that way they don't think that you're going to be threatening or scary or preachy. He's this person you can talk to. Having other people in your team assist with that can be really beneficial, because otherwise they might think that I'm just here to talk to them about death, and for most people that's just not a conversation, even end of life, they want to have in such a blunt fashion.
I've definitely found that to be true too. What about you, Cheryl?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I usually we have badges at the Brigham too that say chaplain. It gives me away, and it's
Mine
because
says intern, so I get away with a lot.
no, doesn't your lanyard say?
Oh, my lanyard does. You're right,
Yeah.
actually.
It's because we respond to emergencies all over the campus, so it's actually helpful when we respond to emergencies because the team knows who we are. I wish it said something else. But I usually, I do begin with, you know, I'm just checking on your spirits. A lot of people are checking on your body. How are you doing? How's this admission going? And I will sometimes say, is this, did you know that you were going to be hospitalized? Was that a planned admission, or was this a surprise? And I often will ask, you know, who are the people cheering for you right now, or what is your network of support like? Stuff like that. I love that you play video games. You know, I would absolutely do that. Yeah. There was something else. It'll come back. This is what it was. I really think it's important. It's important to me. And one thing I try to be mindful of is how disempowering. And you sort of said that when you talked about like having your dignity stripped away a little bit. I don't know that that can ever really be taken away, but it feels like it can be. And so I think one of the roles that I try to choose to play is to be empowering instead of disempowering. And so I'll sometimes say things like, you have a lot of people coming in from all different disciplines that you can't say no to, but I'm one of the ones you can say no to. And to give them the choice, but to also say, you know, I'm really just here to support you, and we know that you're much more than your body, and that there's a whole story that comes with you, and I'm here to help you support that part of you. But you can say no. And I think that that means a lot. That's usually how they'll usually say yes if they know they can say no, which I understand. So I think it's a matter of it all goes back to sort of being really respectful of the fact that this is a person with inherent dignity and beauty and a whole story that I don't know. But it's an extraordinary privilege to be able to just walk in here and offer.
Yeah, it sounds like that piece of offering and just accompanying someone is really central to, especially if someone doesn't have really traditional and particular religious needs, that piece of just being able to accompany someone in a difficult situation is the really critical key. Another metaphor, I don't think anyone's mentioned yet, a metaphor that we use a lot in spiritual care is a person in a well. You're walking by this helpful stranger, walking by a person in the well, you look down, and spiritual care isn't talking down at that person and saying, I can help you. It's climbing down into the well with them and joining them where they are and being present with them while, you know, whether they ever get out or not. I think that's
Power for versus power over. Right?
I do have another question, but I think that what might be best is if we go ahead and just sort of open it up to like let a bigger discussion with the folks who are here with us today. So I'm going to take my mic down. Zach, if you don't mind just passing it to anyone. Does anyone have anything they want to share or have a question that they'd like to bring up with the panel today?
Hi, thank you for sharing. My name is Kuyen and I'm a student here. I have a question about that metaphor of climbing down with someone. And so in your work, you have been with many lives that have passed away. And I just wonder about the journey of you walking back up after you walk down with the people. And how that journey has been, that has meant anything.
Take a shot. It's a good question. If I hear your question correctly, it's sort of how do we companion and actually walk alongside the journey and then continue on our own journey and take care of ourselves in the midst of that. I'll tell a story about a patient that I had that I got to know quite well over several admissions. His name was Sam, and I know that he wouldn't mind me saying that, and he has passed away since. But I got to know him pretty well, and he was not a religious man. He had no religion, but we had a lot of wonderful conversations together. And in his last admission in the acute care setting, he was being discharged to hospice. And so it was our last conversation, and we were saying our goodbyes to each other. And I at the end of our conversation, I said, Sam, is there anything else that I can do for you before I go? And he said, no, I'm good. And I think probably with a lump in both of our throats, we gave each other a hug. And I got to the door, and he said, "Wait a second, Cheryl, if you could do, there's actually one thing that you could do that would mean a lot to me." And I came back and I said, "Sure, what can I do, Sam?" And he said, "If you would just tell me that you don't just go to the next room and never think of me again, that would mean a lot to me." And I went back to my office and I wrote "Remember Sam" on a little piece of paper, and I put it on my bulletin board. And for Sam, I think the extraordinary thing that he was saying, that I've thought about and I continue to think about, is that somehow that commingling of our stories was going to continue to contribute to his well-being even after we parted ways. And when you really think about that, that's pretty amazing. And that just knowing that would mean something to him. But I've had this piece of paper on my bulletin board, and it is a really important question. The other part of it I think your question is, how do I put all these pieces of paper, all these names, all these stories into my heart in a way that he's saying is so meaningful for him, but isn't destructive for me? And how do we carry that? And so, I mean, this is probably maybe another discussion for another time, but it's really about compassion fatigue. But I think it's important, and I think the strategies for self-care are really important and not that hard. For me, it's a matter of being a part of a peer group and being able to share the stories, not for clinical feedback, but to say, this is what happened, this is what's sitting here. I'm still thinking about this one, or some, there's some deaths that are expected after a life beautifully lived with a peaceful, loving support system, and there's others that are impossible to make sense of, and very tragic. And there's visual material and auditory material that stays with us. So I think your question is a good one. I think that there's different self-care strategies that are different for different people. I'm a very, very heavy introvert myself, so for me, I restore myself in solitude, whereas other people may restore themselves in community and in conversation. So I think it's a matter of knowing that we need to do it and knowing what our renewal zones are, and doing it. But there is, what Sam was saying matters for both of us.
Thank you. Can I just add on? Can I just add on a bit? I find it. I was surprised that you interpreted the question as a strategy for self-compassion, which is something I didn't think of. But now that you said it, really made a lot of sense. What I was having in mind was after walking with the person, and then now you had different path with that person. How are you different? Which is related, but not exactly self-care. There's part of it, but there's like, a life that has seen more death, I think is very different from a life that has not seen that many death. That's, yeah. So if you...
Yeah, so how has our worldview, sort of our...
Yeah.
I don't want to dominate.
So essentially asking,
Sorry, did I miss that?
when we spend so much time being low, how does that not change how we see the possibilities for the world? Or
Yeah. However you want to interpret it, I don't want to frame an answer.
right. Yeah, I kind of agree with Cheryl on that. When you see a lot of what people would refer to as bad stuff, death is a part of life. You can view it as positive or negative. Death is just, it is what it is. But when you see a lot of it, it's hard to come out of it. You develop a standard and it becomes a norm almost, and then you have to remember that, okay, this is a part of someone's life. This does not define them, and it does not define my life either, but I work with this. And it's kind of one of those things. You have to have very good boundaries. You have to go in there understanding that part of this process is going to be, I have to now dig a little harder for myself in order for me to be able to function. And with Cheryl, I kind of agree. You got to build in those self-care aspects, throughout the day. Really, even when you're not expecting something that's going to be heavy on you, you got to build in the expectation that you have to have some moment of decompression. I tell nurses all the time, when you have a death, you're going to have at least 20 minutes of alone time for yourself. If you're an extreme introvert, especially, go listen to some music, do something that's going to get your mind off of it. But there has to be a moment of pause where you're not just a machine, you're not just a robot. And for instance, one of the things that we do every single year, just last night, we had a memorial service for everybody that passed away on our unit last year. And that's an opportunity for us to say, you know what, this really kind of sucks. But, we're doing this thing together. We're going to take a pause. We're going to acknowledge it. And we're going to use this moment to help us identify moving forward how we can care for ourselves better so that when you hit that moment, it's more manageable.
I might want to use language that'll be odd in a humanist setting, but encountering people's stories is holy work and it's sacred work, and witnessing pain is like holy and sacred work. You feel like inexplicably right in being there with someone. And so perspective does shift. In a year, I probably love more people who die on me than most people will have in their entire lifetime. And it makes love more poignant because I understand how very temporal it is. I'm not going to say every patient is loved similarly because that's just not true. I'm human. But how I'm changed climbing up out of the well is being much more in touch with like this old language that was used in New England when these were still colonies of memento mori, like remember that you're mortal. In that our time is very short. So when my baby son is laughing, I'm going to take the video of it because I need the recording of it, because I need those 15 seconds of unspeakable joy to be played on my phone when I've just encountered a Holocaust survivor who's telling me the stories of the camps that he can't tell his children, but he needs to tell before he dies. It's realizing what my place is in seeing that this is sacred work that I'm doing. So I don't think of like holiness as something of like someone who's just out in a cave being solitary and trying to deprive themselves of everything. Like holiness is entering into human suffering and being witness to the raw humanity that's still there.
Thank you. Thank you.
One of the things that we do when people are experiencing a terminal illness or they're dying, that comes very natural for people to do a life review and to just tell their story from beginning to end for somebody who will actually listen to the story. And that's an extraordinary privilege that I think the three of us have probably done over and over and over again. And it does change. It does change us in a really extraordinarily beautiful way, I feel, where I don't always get it right, but I'm reminded every day of what matters and what doesn't, and what people wish they had spent more time with, wish they had spent less time with, what some of the regrets are. So it's, I think for me, one of the greatest gifts to me personally is that I don't live life as if I will never die. Because I'm reminded of that all the time, and I don't get that right. I also have learned that death is such a mystery and people who aren't dying don't quite think of it the same way as people who are. It changes a lot. and that's that's okay. My kids, we're in a trauma center at the Brigham. My kids have told me that they can tell what kind of day I've had by my text messages. So our assumptive worldview and the safety does change, but I think it's also, as you called it sacred, and I think that word is appropriate here as well. It's privileged and sacred work that we do that does change us.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your insight today. I think my introduction to the topic was through a book called Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. And I thought it was great to get the perspective of like a physician and realize that like they too are kind of not just a cog in the machine, and there are like starting to be discussions about humanity that extend past like what people might be getting educated in. But I guess like working alongside physicians specifically, like as part of their team, have you found that, or like if you could change anything about like the kind of training that they're receiving, like do you think there should be more like of this kind of conversation or this kind of discussion that they should be receiving earlier on, like in their education, that you wish you could change? Or is that something that you as a member of the team kind of can step in and like change that environment if you see that there's a problem going on or if there's something lacking in the workplace?
See, that's an interesting one. From my perspective, the way I'm hearing that is, it sounds to me like you're acknowledging that sometimes doctors don't necessarily have the best bedside manner. And that's a reality. The hope is that everyone will be, and this is as a IDT staff member in a disciplinary team, which includes physicians, that everyone will be in touch enough with their humanity to be compassionate whenever they're providing care to someone. And the reality is, we can't control everything. Sometimes it just happens, and you got someone that makes the situation worse rather than making it better. So in those circumstances, obviously you want to be there to help kind of support and do things, but you absolutely want any professional to be in touch with this reality as well. So, and I work at a level 1 trauma center as well, and we do train physicians specifically early on in the process. Just earlier this week, I was working with first-year medical students on understanding, well, what is palliative care and what does a spiritual caregiver provide within the interdisciplinary team? So they have that concept very early on, so they know when to actually contact a spiritual provider versus when it's appropriate for them to just kind of go ahead and give the care that they can. But we do quite often, we will be present in different meetings in order to assist the process, because we might expect that certain things will not go as we hope. So.
There's something about that question that I want to nuance. For folks outside of healthcare, they often think of healthcare as being primarily like a physician leading a team, and physicians spend a remarkably little amount of time with patients. Really, they're signing off on what the nurses are doing, and then they might be doing some diagnostic work, or if they're surgeons, they're doing the like surgical technical work. But the vast majority of the care that's received in healthcare is really done by nurses. According to the Joint Commission's requirements, nurses are to be tending towards the spiritual needs of the patients. You can get your RN in a 2-year program, and in that time you will not be prepared to address your patient's spiritual needs. Yet you're now responsible for it, and what you think of as spiritual may not necessarily be what is the Medicare understanding of what spiritual is. And yet now you're in the position of power and authority. Medical administration is almost exclusively run by nurses. And so they're really the power brokers, and much more the drivers of the healthcare industry. If there's educational work to be done, I think that that would be a much more powerful entry point than just focusing on physicians.
I think there's a huge range in physicians. You know, I think some are like Dr. Gawande, and are becoming more and more aware of the cost of you know, the question isn't can we, it's should we, now for so many cases. And I think a lot of physicians are becoming more aware of that. And I think it's really painful for the team to be caring for patients in ways that's causing suffering, and not doesn't provide a reasonable hope for care. And that's often the case. So there's suffering on that side too, and sometimes within the family, this terrible conflict and spiritual distress around redirecting care and decisions around end of life. And that's a place I think where chaplains and spiritual care can really come in and help communicate, and help people express what they're most afraid of and what the options are. And like, you know, for the religious patient, it might be a lot of, or the religious doctor, concerns around what's morally obligatory around keeping life, sustaining life. And for the not religious person or the unaffiliated person, it's around, you know, it's around letting go. It's around what's going to happen to the family, or who will we be if we lose him. So at the end of the day, the questions are the same. It's the language that's different. But I think we started a thing at the Brigham this year that we had some of the medical interns coming in, and we had them shadow chaplains for half a day, which was really cool. It was really, yeah. And they were really very touched by that. And I think that it expanded their understanding of the scope of what we do, and they're more likely to call us in. And yeah, so I think we're getting there, but it still depends. It depends on a lot of things.
I got a book I want to throw out for you. It's a book called When Breath Becomes Air. And this was written by a physician. He's since passed away, but it was written by a physician as he was experiencing his own end-of-life process, and he reflects on that very thing that you're talking about, what his experience from healthcare professionals, spiritual care providers, and how he was kind of evolving in that process as well. And I'm going to butcher his name. His name's Paul, I want to say Callahan, maybe, but I might get that wrong. But When Breath Becomes Air, it's a good one to check out.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sure. Thank you. My question concerns advice that you may have for families. Is there any benefit that you can harvest from your experience about how families can be better prepared to interact with chaplains? Or is it something that people will just come to when they get them into that situation?
So the latter part of your question is where I'm stuck, how to interact with chaplains?
Well, I guess here's if I could try to be more precise about my question, is when someone goes in hospital and they're in acute care, or there's a life-threatening episode, it throws the family system into a terrible state of disarray. Is there anything that, with your experience and having seen this repeated many times, any advice that you can offer to the hospital, to the chaplain, to the family, on any dimension for helping with that?
Well, I would start by saying, it's for the family, talk. A lot of times what I've experienced is the families haven't exactly talked about end of life at all. There's an expectation. We try to find out what their expectations are. And once you get them talking about it, it kind of removes some of the barriers so that then whoever comes in the room can actually be there to help rather than being, someone who's oppositional to life. But really just talking and listening to each other. That's kind of where it has to start, and then you really take it from there. The chaplain should be skilled enough to be able to observe at that point to see what the family's needs are. So yeah, really just a starting point.
Sometimes the chaplain's role is to get the family away from the patient. Family at times can be insufferable to someone who's sick and have boundaries that are far worse than non-family, just because of the identity of being, this person's family member. You think that privileges you to an amount of time, an amount of emotional energy that someone who's ill might not have. So I've definitely run interference for a patient by taking the family member out to get coffee. It's seeing when is it your role to provide the humanizing factor by just letting the patient have some peace and quiet. Because no matter how much, I love my family, there's times when, in January when I was hospitalized, where I would tell my wife to go home because I'm in pain and I feel terrible and I want to be alone because it's only going to be another hour before they come and stick me with another sharp. When you're really ill, you might not be able to be that blunt. And so I think that is also a role of spiritual caregivers, because we're trained in family dynamics and looking for energetic sensitivity, just what's the emotional energy in this room and when does this person need some peace and quiet.
A couple of thoughts. One of the things I've become pretty convinced of in working with families over the years is that all families are dysfunctional. Every single one of them, including mine. And they have worked for decades and decades and decades to get their dysfunction just the way they like it. And in the midst of a health crisis or a serious illness is not the time for some kind stranger to come in and try to repair that or change that. So it's always just kind of, and I think these guys, I'm hearing it from them too, sort of observe this system and know that this system that's kind of has this, like the universe with all these kind of odd planets and orbits and cancer or an illness like this is like another planet, and it makes the whole kind of system have to rearrange itself sometimes, and people are in different roles. And one of the things that they all are in the family is scared. And so I think, for me, it goes back to what I said earlier about empowering, and to sort of let this family function the way they do. I'm always kind of looking for is this a top-down power system, or is this a pretty equal power system? And to recognize that people grieve differently, and they're in different places, and to help them allow each other to grieve in different ways, and to not expect the other one to be grieving in the same way that you are today. And I think another thing that family members do an awful lot of, that I think we can play an important role in, is protecting each other and being afraid for other people, and being sort of making assumptions about what the other person wants. So I think we can really play a role in giving voice, and helping people articulate what's happening for them, and that's often I think really important part of redirecting care too.
So I don't want to make this too much of a policy question, but I'm curious what you think, what kind of reforms you think could be made in medical education. I know you mentioned that you had medical interns shadow you at Brigham the other day. And I'm just wondering what role spirituality could play in medical training, if any. And because I just know there's a problem sometimes with patients being objectified by doctors and, not being treated as human beings. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on how, medicine could be kind of humanized and what role spirituality could play with that.
Well, if you have a suggestion, I would suggest that you tell every educator that they need to incorporate that as part of their training. I think that's something that has been talked about for a long time, and finding the place to make that a priority has been a struggle. Because for so long, the discipline has been so focused on the medical care and how do you separate medical from physical, spiritual, emotional kind of supports. And I would say, yeah, it's extremely lacking in that area. So I would say, kind of like the shadowing opportunities for right now have been the primary vehicle by which, whether nurses, social workers, doctors, any other person in the interdisciplinary team can actually get some of that spiritual understanding. But it's not done in the way that they receive their other academic training, which kind of changes the way that they receive it. But also at the same time, I think if we focused a little more on the actual shadowing and being a part of the spiritual care process, it would enhance greatly the medical understanding of what they're learning, even because incorporating that and seeing it from a whole human perspective will actually enhance your medical education.
And I think, to give them a little bit of spiritual care too, because they pick up bits and pieces of the stories, and they're so imprinted in med school with curing, that's what they're there to do, is to add days to lives. And I think by giving them some spiritual care too, and inviting them to be with us, validating their humanity, because it's hard for them. They're under tremendous pressure in the healthcare institutions that they're working in, and I think a lot of them, if not most of them, are actually pained by this, and suffer in the midst of the pressure that they're under, to cure and prolong life, when it's not always what they know is the right thing to do. So I think directing spiritual care toward them is a great way to help them know. And there's an expression, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And I will often point out to doctors when they do a really good job, or when a patient says to me, yeah, I love her, she really cares, which is how patients usually say whether their doctor is good. It's always by whether or not they feel like the person cares. So I'll just try to kind of positively reinforce what I hear too.
There's language that you used that I want to uplift of policy shifts. It would really need to be Medicare policy shifts. Right now, physicians aren't compensated for bedside manner. They're compensated for fixing problems. Their economic success is on finding what's wrong and fixing it. They're not compensated for patient health. They're compensated on just like fixing this one dis-ease. If there was a compensation model that was focused on overall patient health, patient well-being, you would see far less extraneous imaging that is now ordered, but it's often ordered because the physician is frightened of lawsuits. And so they'll order unnecessary tests that make our healthcare unnecessarily expensive, and they think that that's what's doing a good and thorough job. If you want policy shift to humanize that role, it's also economically privileging wellness over fixing problems, and having them spend time with chaplains is nice, because a great thing that's taught in CPE is that you can fix nothing. Like, as a chaplain, these people have health concerns that you cannot touch, and you're still just to be there and be present. So you get really comfortable being completely powerless in the face of suffering, and knowing that your only power is walking alongside them in this journey. Physicians don't ever get that education, so they feel profoundly threatened when they're powerless of some kind of illness in this person that they can't fix. And that's really threatening to their identity. And until we have true healthcare reform, we just don't economically privilege wellness.
And and also on the policy piece, maybe like even on a broader level, I don't know if this has been made clear, but at hospitals, chaplaincy services and spiritual care services almost never, certainly not at the Brigham at least, are not billable services. So it's not like you get approval from your insurance to have a chaplain come visit, anything like that. It's something that the hospital provides because they know, okay, we know some patients need this. And so we will provide this. And that means that a lot of chaplaincies, this is true at universities too, a lot of chaplaincies really have to advocate for our role and then like say like this is what we offer and look at what these patients have reported that we were able to offer them. And that's how they get funding from that institution. And so, and I think how this relates very much to kind of like this growing population of non-religious people is there's definitely a cultural assumption that, or at least while the cultural assumption is that, okay, non-religious people don't really need chaplains, so if 30% of our patients are saying they're not affiliated, that's that many fewer chaplains that we need to cover that space. And if you make it clear that there are all sorts of spiritual needs or really existential needs that those patients have, then it becomes so much more clear why you do need a really robust and well-funded chaplaincy or spiritual care department in your institution, and also all the value that that can provide. And another piece is just that has been mentioned by everyone, I think, is that increasingly, again, also in universities, but in hospitals, chaplains are a part of this interdisciplinary team, and that's like sort of collaboration really like it broadens what we think of when we think of what a chaplain or a spiritual care provider does, and it broadens what our role can potentially be, and it broadens how we understand our own role. And I think that the more that institutions invest in that, universities, hospitals, prisons, the more investment in that kind of role, the better it can be, like by definition almost, So.
Thank you for sharing everything. I was curious if you have any thoughts about, in Massachusetts, we use the MOST form for orders for life-sustaining treatment, and that's supposed to be a conversation with their doctor regarding explanations and understanding. And I was wondering if you've ever thought of having a partnership with a doctor during that conversation with the client, or expanding your role in other ways like that that might help facilitate communication.
Sure. The way that it works in my hospice is the social worker is most often responsible for the MOST form if there's not a MOST form that's signed prior to admission. And it's a conversation that the social worker will have with the client if the client's cognitively capable, if not, then with the client's family. And then it's signed by a physician once it's been filled out. So that way, there's someone who can take the time to have the conversation around what this means. And when there's clients that have family who are really hesitant about making someone a DNR, sometimes the social worker doesn't want to have the conversation of how awful resuscitation is. And so then I've been pulled in to be the one to have the really difficult conversation about why you really want your loved one to be a DNR. Because
do not resuscitate.
Yeah, do not resuscitate. Because I'm unafraid of having that conversation of brutal detail of what trauma you're going to cause your loved one if you want them to receive CPR, even though they're 80 and their body is riddled with cancer, and so you're guaranteeing them punctured lungs. I've done enough end-of-life work where when I need to be terminally blunt, I will be terminally blunt if a family member needs that information. I don't think physicians have time to have that length of a conversation. You'd be surprised how little time physicians actually spend in doing care.
I'm gonna offer different, at the Brigham, I think that the physicians are the ones that take the lead on that conversation. And in general and I know that this isn't true everywhere and certainly not true for every physician, but I think it is possible for physicians to take the lead and to do a pretty good job on that conversation. Usually at Brigham, we'll get pulled in, and we do get pulled in when the information has been given, but there's a struggle around what the right thing to do is, or when there's a difference in the family, the spouse is saying, no, please, 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 let them, please go for this last thing, go for this, or when there's adult children that are conflicted over what to do. That's when they'll pull us in around helping people sort out the right decision for them. But I don't give them information or have an agenda about what they should do. I think that I want that to come from them.
You definitely don't want an agenda. Physicians should be the ones signing DNR orders. The way it works for us, a lot of times I will actually have conversations with folks because I'm not only advanced care planning facilitator, but also do a lot of advanced directives and things. And our consult service is the area where you meet the physician and the chaplain and social worker before they become actual inpatient. And we try to have these goals of care conversations, family meetings, where we actually address this as a team. Because you're right, it is hard for one perspective to come in. If you're explaining things strictly medically, and you're watching Grey's Anatomy or something, and you're understanding something that's completely fabricated, and you don't have someone that's going to articulate it in a language that you understand, well, everything's going to get messed up. And that's kind of why we have a whole team of people that are going there and do that. But also, no agendas there. If you have an understanding that you want to keep going and stay full code, then the chaplain is going to support that, continuing to understand why you chose that, but making sure that you understand medically, what some of the risks are and how that can impact your life.
I think that this is a place where the acute care setting, a hospital palliative setting, and a hospice setting are really different. You're not eligible for hospice if you are not agreeing to participate in the hospice plan of care. The hospice plan of care, by Medicare definition, means you're not looking for life-sustaining treatment. You're looking for palliation of terminal symptoms, but you're not looking to unnaturally prolong life. So we very much have an agenda of palliating suffering and getting people towards a DNR is a way of palliating suffering. That if in other settings wanting to be a full code, like by all means, but it means that you're operating outside of the hospice plan of care. So in a hospice setting means you're not eligible to be on our service.
And in America specifically, as I understand it, with how tied hospice is to Medicare, like so much of this is.
Medicare guidelines are what started hospice being something that could be paid for. That was back in '83. And private insurers will just mirror whatever the Medicare benefit legislation is. Because it's what has dictated what is hospice.
Yeah. Time for one more question, and we'll wrap up for the night. Dan, you want to go ahead?
Hi, thank you all for being here. So I did CPE residency at Mass General last year. And so in terms of, I found for me there was kind of almost a struggle, an existential kind of tension between not having an agenda as a spiritual care provider, really meeting people where they are, and really seeing and knowing that we live in this death-denying culture where we, and I find myself even not using the language of death and dying, instead saying so-and-so passed on, and that's what I grew up with too. We just didn't really talk about death. And so on the one hand, I don't want to have an agenda, with a patient or with a person, or even in dealing with family members who might be sick. On the other hand, I almost feel like I have to be an evangelist, if you will, to talk about the reality of death and to actually use the language of death. And one way that I did that for myself is I completed the 5 wishes, which is advanced care booklet, a very user-friendly kind of booklet, and doesn't require doctor sign-off or anything. And I'm curious what you think. Do you think that people who are who are healthy, who are not facing an illness, who are not facing death and dying, should really become more knowledgeable about things like the 5 wishes and actually fill them out and have them on record at their doctor's office? I'm just kind of curious to hear what your thoughts are on all of that, or some of that.
I think people absolutely should think about that and fill out and communicate to their family what their wishes are around end of life. And one of the real burdens for whoever is the healthcare proxy, the person making the decisions, is that they often feel, and I've heard these words so many times, I feel like I'm playing God. I don't want to play God, because they don't want to sign something that the outcome could be the end of this person's life. And one of the things I think that I always work toward helping, I'm sure these guys too, is to realize that you're not making the decision, but you're the person who knows your loved one best. And you're the person who can tell us what he or she would want to do if they could speak to us. And so you're a mouthpiece, not a decision maker, but they can't really be that unless they know it, that person. It's so much better for them. They could take their best guess if they had never had that conversation. But if they had the conversation, then they really know that they're being the mouthpiece for this person. And what an honor that is. And it takes that terrible burden of, I'm the one doing this, off of their shoulders. It's a tough place. I mean, I hear what you're saying, where we don't have an agenda, but it's really hard to watch futile measures being taken or people acting out of fear. But I think as spiritual caregivers, we can explore the fear, and to work with the fear and help people start to articulate what they're most afraid of, or what they're protecting, or what their spiritual distress is. Then you can kind of help them get to their own agenda, which I think the outcome would probably be more peaceful for them and more peaceful for us if we could explore the fear. So that's agenda-free way to get to the same place, I think.
I know that y'all had a death cafe here. Was it last week? Death cafe is really great concept. Similar organization started about a similar time frame in America. It's the Conversation Project. In its languages, it's better to have these conversations around the dinner table than around the hospital table. Anything you can do to have the conversations early, have the conversations in low anxiety settings, means you'll have the fortitude to make the decisions when you're in the high anxiety settings. I'm on my organization's ethics panel, and I can't tell you how many cases we have, which is the same thing of the person had very clear wishes when they were cognitively capable of not wanting extensive life-saving interventions done, but the family's just not on board with it, and due to fears of lawsuits, unless there's an ironclad legal document stating the wish, if any family member is like, no, this person needs to be alive at all costs, then any institution in fear of lawsuits will keep that person alive at all costs. So have those conversations now and make it very clear and give legal authority to the people who you know will make the right decision. I've had patients whose healthcare proxies, instead of being family members, might be in-laws because they know they'll be dispassionate enough to actually carry out these wishes.
I'm going to be real blunt with this. The day you turn 18, you should start having those conversations. The reality is you don't want yourself, you don't want to put your family in a position when they're making decisions for you that aren't right. Okay, you could be going out drinking, having a night of fun, and all of a sudden you get in a car accident and then you're brain dead. But your family doesn't think you're brain dead because your body is still there. Okay, and this is why these conversations are really important. It's not going to bring on anything because you had the conversation, but it's a way to articulate your desires, your wants, but also it does things for relationships as well. You know, it helps identify who those people are that can speak on your behalf. It's not something that you want to have someone who's automatic. Just because someone's your spouse doesn't make them the best medical agent for you, because there's different conflicts of interest. So this is important for everyone to do. And once again, once you turn 18, you really should be having these kind of conversations.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, thank you all very much for being here with us tonight, and thank you all as well. We've had a really thoughtful and also somber conversation tonight. And I think before we go, I think it might be we've all touched on this in different ways, and we had the question that Quinn asked about self-care. But I'd love if we could just share your name again and maybe a place that you find joy in life before we leave today, if you don't mind. So, Andrew, do you mind?
I'm gonna force something upon y'all. I'm gonna play you the sound of my son laughing, and this is as close to like directly injecting joy into my blood veins as you can get. And so, in many ways, he is my self-care.
Very good. And Cheryl?
That was good self-care right there. Yeah, I mean, the things that are popping into my head is my, my family creation. It's spring. I was driving here from Brigham, and the Sox are playing the Yankees. The sailboats are on the river. Tomorrow's Friday. The unit's over. I'm almost done writing evaluations. And I think as somber as these conversations feel, it also feels very privileged. And the flip side is that the joys in life and the gifts of life and the smell of springtime is even sweeter. So,
She stole my thunder. Jason Callahan.
you're not a Yankees fan, Jason?
Neither Boston or New York. I'm from Cleveland. It's okay. But being a chaplain, and I'm going to echo what everyone said, it really does enhance your ability to receive life in different ways. It forces you to really be present in ways that you don't have to unless you're forced to. When you don't have the option, it can be a really fulfilling thing. So the things like going home to family and understanding, with death eventually coming one day, that these moments right here are special and significant to me. So I find great joy in that. And also in the daily self-care I do, like my walk to my car so I can decompress before I go home so I don't have to bring my stuff to them. That's where I find joy. So all over the place, nature, but also at the same time built into the kind of care that I provide at the bedside. It is the greatest honor in my life.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you all very much.
Thanks.
Yeah. So this is the last program with the Humanist Chaplaincy this semester until commencement, and so good luck everybody with the rest of your years and the oncoming summer, whether you're in school or not. And we'll hang out for a bit afterwards, and you can talk to us individually. But otherwise, I wish you well and happy spring.